Despite it being frequently underappreciated, the bass, whether it be in the form of a bass guitar or something else, has historically been a crucial piece of countless musical genres throughout history. In Western culture, it's pretty safe to say that some form of bass has been present in all kinds of popular music over the years, whether we're talking about modern hip-hop or classical music. Although it's traditionally had a role as a background instrument, the past several decades have given us various musical genres and artists that at times gave the bass more of a prominent role. That being said, if we're talking about rock music specifically, the bass is often still regarded as a background instrument first and foremost. However, there is one rock scene that I personally would say has given more attention to out-of-control bass playing than almost every other scene in that musical world.
How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and today we're going to be drifting slightly away from our usual style of content to discuss not a band or a subgenre, but really a concept that exists in a unique form within punk rock. As I'm sure you can tell from the title, that subject is none other than the frequently overlooked art of punk bass playing. And as I'm sure those of us who are more than casual listeners can certainly attest that there's been some criminally underrated basses to come out of the world of punk rock. So in this video, I'm going to do my best to walk you all through the history of punk bass shredding and shout out more than a couple of key players along the way. And finally, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways!
So of course, if you know your general punk history, then I'm sure you know things really started happening in the mid to late 70s with the arrival of bands like the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and the Dead Boys that solidified punk rock's first wave. Although I'm sure a few of you are probably thinking of Sid Vicious right off the bat here, as he is technically a famous punk bass player, but if you're familiar with the story of the Sex Pistols to any extent, then I'm sure you're well aware that he was not a particularly talented musician. I'm not gonna go into too much detail about this here, especially since now there's an entire Hulu series about the Sex Pistols, but he pretty much learned to play his instrument by performing with the band while they were on stage. Or in other words, he was a lot more of a showman than an actual musician. That said, the first bass player I want to highlight here does in fact come from the 70s UK scene, and I don't think we should start this lecture off with anyone else other than Paul Simonon from The Clash. Having come of age during the 70s in the UK, he and the rest of The Clash drew a great deal of their influence from the Jamaican ska and reggae stuff that first developed its own English subscene towards the end of the 60s. If you know anything about ska and reggae, then you know groovy bass lines are something those genres are very well known for, and I think the influence is super noticeable in Paul Simonon's laid-back, moving bass playing style. With his groovy, rounded bass playing though, Simonon has a tendency to sound a little more like a ska bassist in a punk band rather than someone purely from the punk rock world. And while this certainly is not an attack on him or The Clash, I don't think I'm the only one who would say that at times they sound a little more reggae than they do punk.
While the UK punk scene was working more on playing style and technique, the punk bassists in the States were diving more into tone and sound, and the US scene would give us our first real punch of crusty punk rock bass tone in the town of Lodi, New Jersey.
So in case you didn't already get the memo, the next key player in punk bass history is the Misfits' Jerry Only. While I'm not gonna say he was necessarily the first bassist in punk history to define tone or something really pretentious like that, I think it's pretty safe to say that he did set a standard for it at the very least. He was one of the first players to really pioneer that fuzzy, warm amp sound paired with the clangy, loose high end that quickly became a go-to sound for a lot of punk bassists all over the world. For all of you non-musicians who might be watching, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, let me give you an example of a bass tone like this in isolation. As you can probably tell just by listening to the Misfits music though, Jerry Only is definitely the type of bassist who likes to keep things a little more on the simple side. Although he certainly did a lot on the tone front, it wouldn't be until the punk bands of the 80s found their footing a little more that we would see punk bass playing really step up its game.
However, before we get to that, I want to draw our attention back to the UK for a second, but this time towards the country's metal scene, as I don't think this video would be complete without a mention of Motorhead's vocalist and bassist Lemmy Kilmister. I don't think anyone would deny that Motorhead made just as big a mark on punk as they did on metal, but I think Lemmy's playing was exceptionally influential on punk bass as it became more and more technical towards the end of the 80s. So once the early 80s were underway, we were really starting to get the first glimpse of all the different things punk rock would grow into. And along with that, we got a number of fantastic bass players.
Right off the bat, I want to dive back into the UK scene because now everything that The Clash, the Sex Pistols, and all the other first-gen Brit bands had started was now being twisted and stretched into all kinds of different musical ideas. And one of the most important scenes of that era was the one that birthed the Anarcho and Crust sounds. The reason I'm bringing this stuff up first here is because these bands took what Jerry Only had started to the utmost extremes for the first time. Quite honestly, some of these albums sound like the bass players were just playing through guitar amps on a distortion channel. And they very well could have been, given that a lot of these bands didn't have very much extra cash lying around to spend on one of those big muff fuzz pedals that you'll see a lot of elder crust bands using these days. Not to mention, folks have definitely been known to switch from guitar to bass, so if one crusty guitar player was looking to start a band but they had a friend who was a better guitarist, all they needed to do was buy a bass and plug it into their fuzzy guitar amp, and next thing they knew, they've got a bass tone that sounds like hear nothing, see nothing, say nothing. Beneath all that sludgy, bassy goodness, though, there were actually a lot of really capable players in this scene, and somebody who could really play his ass off was Rudimentary Penny's Grant Matthews. Like most anarcho bands from this era, I think we can assume that Rudimentary Penny was at least a little influenced by The Clash, and you can really hear Paul Simon and ska bass playing style in some of the groovy walking bass lines throughout Rudy's catalog. If you know your anarcho and crust punk though, then I'm sure you can attest that there were also plenty of tone chasers in this scene who put a lot more emphasis on discovering nasty bass tones than shredding. But that certainly doesn't make this stuff any less important to punk bass, because now the seed had been planted. Distortion on bass was cool as fuck, and Powerviolence, grindcore, and death metal would be just a few genres that would work this concept into their standard as a result of influence from British hardcore. If we're gonna talk about punk bass shredding in the 80s though, I don't think I'm the only one who would say that no one was doing it quite like the skate punks were. First things first, we need to talk about Louis Mayorga from Suicidal Tendencies, who for at least a few years might have been the best punk bassist on the entire planet, or at least when Suicidal Tendencies first came out. He was a real bass player, playing fingerstyle over the lightning fast drum grooves of the early ST stuff, and while I can't say for certain he was the first person to do this, he was certainly one of the first people to introduce this type of fast, out of control bass playing to punk rock. Something you might not know about him is that he actually wrote a lot of the early Suicidal Tendencies stuff, including their infamous hit song Institutionalized. While it's definitely important to also mention Bob Heathcote and Robert Trujillo here, as both of those guys would hold down the low end beautifully during their time in Suicidal, their eras were during what I like to call the metal years, so naturally those guys had more of a metal vibe to their playing. Both phenomenal players nonetheless though, especially in the case of Trujillo, who would later go on to play in Metallica. I've done an entire video about Suicidal Tendencies, and you can find a link to that in the description below if you want to learn more about them. But before we move on, I also want to bring up Louis Mayorga's band Lewicidal, that's put out a couple of pretty fire old school skate punk albums that are definitely worth checking out. While we're on the topic of kick-ass California punk bass licks, I also have to bring up Descendants bassist Tony Lombardo, Doug Carrion, and most importantly Carl Alvarez, who remains their bass player to this day. Lombardo and Carrion of course delivered spectacular performances on everything the Descendants put out between the years of 1979 and 1986, but I don't think I'd be the only one who'd say that Carl Alvarez was the bassist who really helped the Descendants find their groove. They'd always been a jammy band for sure, but when Alvarez made his debut on the All record in 1987, I feel like something about his playing truly brought the band together. Just like Louis Mayorga, Alvarez was another finger player that could just play his ass off, and especially in tracks like Clean Sheets and Coolidge, he really gave fans of the era an idea of what a melodic, catchy bass groove could do for a punk song. He would also take on the bass duties for all of the All records, and fuck did he light those things up with some groovy lines. There were, of course, a whole bunch of other kick-ass bass players in the skate punk scene back in the day, like Jimmy Callahan from Ill Repute, Chris Tense from Poison Idea, and Jay Bentley from Bad Religion, who I actually think is kind of an underrated bass player in the punk world. He's not a super flashy player, but after having sat down with some of his lines myself when I was a teenager, I have to say his playing is a lot more intricate than you might think. The Canadian band SNFU also had a number of really good bass players throughout the 80s, and pretty much up until they finally called called it a day in 2018.
But if you're someone like me who's a real nut for the old school thrasher skate punk stuff, then I'm sure you know that nobody could play the bass like Little Joe from RKL.
As painfully underrated as RKL are as a band, it's truly mind-blowing just how impactful they were in setting the stage for the next generation of punk bands. And when it comes to the topic of shreddy punk bass, I would argue that they're the most important band to ever happen to punk rock. Nothing like this had ever been done in music before Little Joe came in, picked up a bass, and just ripped the thing up like he was playing guitar for Iron Maiden or something. Watching old clips of him shred is honestly kind of surreal, and I firmly believe that we would never have had players like Matt Freeman, Brian Robinson, or Jim Cherry if not for Little Joe. While Bomber Manzullo was the real mastermind behind the music of RKL, I think it's pretty safe to say that Little Joe took whatever ideas he had for the bass parts and just ran miles with them. Unlike his contemporaries in Louis Mayorga and Carl Alvarez, however, Little Joe played bass with a pick. But the way he played really showed musicians in the scene the kind of agility picking could give you if you really knew what you were doing with a bass.
I of course also have to plug my RKL video here, so if you want to hear more about them, you can find a link to that in the description below.
Along with all the skate punk bands shredding their basses as fast as they could, the 80s punk scene gave us a number of more creative and experimental bands that added a lot of really innovative musical ideas to the scene. In this camp, we had players like Mike Watt from the Minutemen, Joe Lally from Fugazi, and Dave Schultes from the Dead Milkmen. While none of these three guys or any other musicians like them were particularly shreddy players, they and their respective bands brought a lot to the table when it came to new types of songwriting and artistic ideas. I'm certainly not trying to say any of these guys weren't good bass players. They definitely did have a solid groove. They just weren't as lightning quick as Louis Mayorga or Little Joe. While we're definitely getting to the end of the decade here, we certainly cannot finish this chapter off without paying homage to a couple of key basses from the early US hardcore scene, Klaus Fluoride from the Dead Kennedys, and Daryl Jennifer from Bad Brains. Again, these guys also weren't the flashiest players around, but they could both certainly groove and are responsible for a few of the most iconic punk rock bass lines of the 80s. And finally, we also of course have to bring up the oddball subgenre of psychobilly that made its debut in the early 80s as well. While the Cramps were definitely the band to get the ball rolling with this stuff, it was actually the British trio The Meteors who had upped the bass game by throwing in an upright bass. As far as musicianship goes, most of it's typical stand-up bass playing though, and the innovations within the genre over the years came in the form of heavier guitar tones, faster drums, and the frequent crossover with horror punk. I've been meaning to dive a little deeper into this stuff with an entire video of its own, so stay tuned for that if you're interested, but a few psychobilly bands I'd recommend to anyone who's trying to get into it would be the Necromantics, Reverend Horton Heat, Coffin Cats, and Tiger Army.
So by now the scene had truly gotten a taste of what the bass could really do for the different breeds of punk rock, but I don't think it would be until the following decade that we really saw it flourish into the staple that would be talked about for years to follow.
So if you're a fan of bass and 90s punk, then I'm sure one of, if not the first person that's coming to mind right now is the legend himself, Roger Matthew Freeman, otherwise known as Matt Freeman or the punk rock Geddy Lee. Mr. Freeman would get his start as the bassist for the ska punk legends Operation Ivy and made his official debut on the band's 1988 7-inch Hectic that they would follow up a year later with their classic LP Energy. As primitive and raw as these recordings are though, the musicianship here is off the fucking charts, and especially that of Matt Freeman, who delivered killer bassline after bassline as the record punches through each of its 19 tracks. And there's a lot going on here with his playing. First and foremost, there's clearly a ton of influence from Paul Simonon, especially with the pretty apparent Clash influence going on with Operation Ivy overall. But that's certainly not the only thing at work here. Given his instrument of choice and geographical location, I can only assume that Matt was also reasonably familiar with the Dead Kennedys and RKL, and you can hear a good amount of influence from Lil Joe and Klaus Fluoride in his playing too, especially when we dive into his work from the 90s with the band Rancid. Starting off with the debut full-length from 1993, Matt wasted no time slipping into some tasty bass licks before the first track was even over, and midway through the album, his first bass solo on record takes place on the deep cut Rejected. In the 4 years between the releases of Operation Ivy's album and Rancid's debut full-length, there's no question that Matt Freeman had upped his game quite a bit, and this would quickly become a staple in Rancid's sound as their career progressed, especially with the release of their now highly acclaimed third album, And Out Come the Wolves, and its unforgettable opener, Maxwell Murder. In somewhat more recent years, Mr. Freeman has also applied his 4-string talents to the stand-up bass with his side band band Devil's Brigade. They've put out one album and a couple EPs that are pretty good, and I would say are worth checking out if you're into psychobilly-esque punk.
Although it is certainly important to give credit where credit's due, Matt Freeman is by no means the only top-tier punk bassist to take the 90s by storm. And while Rancid were ripping up the East Bay, a certain band called NOFX were making a little more than just a name for themselves down in Los Angeles.
As famous as Fat Mike is in the world of punk, I honestly think he's kind of underrated as a bassist simply because a lot of people tend to think of him more as a songwriter than a particularly skilled bass player. But make no mistake, Fat Mike knows his way around the four strings a lot better than the average punker does, and he's been very outspoken about his love for RKL over the years, both verbally and through his bass playing. Despite how heavy of an influence RKL had on Fat Mike's bass playing, and really on NOFX's music in general, it wouldn't take Mike all that long to find a groove of his own, and I think his playing had a bigger impact on 90s skate punk than a lot of people realize. He'd put together these bass tones and lines that put a lot of emphasis on the high end, and in the early 90s, no one else in the scene had really done anything quite like that. Lil Joe certainly played a number of solos where he got up to the end of the neck on the bass, or Jerry only might have used a super punchy bass tone from time to time, but when Fat Mike started doing things like playing power chords on the top two strings and alternating back and forth between the high and the low notes, he caught the eyes and the ears of a lot of skate punk bass players of the time, and they would later go on to be in bands that filled out his label's roster. A few of these NOFX inspired shredders include 88 Fingers Louie's Joe Principe, who would later go on to be a founding member of Rise Against in the 2000s, Lex Feltham and Michael Dallinger of the band Frenzelrom, Chris Barker from Anti-Flag, and the tragically departed Jim Cherry, the original bassist from Strung Out, as well as Strung Out's current bassist Chris Aiken. I also want to give a couple shoutouts to some bass players from the Epitaph scene of this era, starting off with Joe Escalante from the Vandals. While he was a founding member of the band in 1980, he was actually their drummer until the end of the 80s when he took on the role of bass, and if you ask me, I think he did a pretty damn good job with it. This segment also would not be complete without mentioning Pennywise bass players Jason Thirsk and Randy Bradbury, who brought some serious groove to the band's metallic flavor of skate punk in their respective eras. And last but certainly not least, Lil Joe would continue on with RKL into the 90s with the release of their third and fourth albums Reactivate and Riches to Rags in 1993 and 94. He would also later go on to play in Lagwagon in the early 2010s, which is where he currently resides to this day.
As fun as all the skate punk stuff is though, it certainly was not the only thing to bring the low end to punk rock shows in the 90s, and I think it's about time we gave some love to our smelly friends in the crust punk world once again.
While the 80s gave us our first pinch of how much a filthy distorted bass tone could add to a crust or D-beat album, the 90s brought this to a whole new level. Now a lot of these bands were getting a little more recognition and could afford to produce some nicer quality recordings. Because of this, we now got our first glimpse of what some of these grimy crust tunes could really sound like through a clearer mix. One of the most notable crust bass players of this era, I would say, is Todd Kiesling from the California-based Dystopia. While he wasn't a super flashy player, he and of course the rest of the band brought in this groovy sludge metal element to their breed of crust punk that for its time was a really fresh new thing. Of course they had their contemporaries like Grief and Noothgrush, but I don't think I'm the only person who would say that nobody else had the same gutter punk charm as Dystopia. And I personally feel they were the best sludge crust band of all time, and I also think their records hold up remarkably well. As far as the bass department goes though, Todd Kiesling had the sludge metal thing totally down. He had this really groovy fingerstyle, and this made the sludge elements of Dystopia's music pop in ways that it might not have for other bands. Plus, if you pair that up with the fact that they'd often be playing mid-tempo grooves instead of the stereotypical droning pace of sludge metal, or the lightning-quick tempos of crust punk, laid a really interesting blueprint for a band that fused the two sounds. And if we're talking about bass tone, if you've heard Dystopia's 1994 full-length Human Equals Garbage, then I'm sure you know that Todd here knew just the right amount of fuzz to make his bass tone absolutely disgusting when he needed to, and he also knew when to dial it back for a nice round background tone. And if you ask me, I think he has some of the tastiest bass sounds in all of crust punk. All of that being said though, Dystopia were definitely not the only crust punk band in the 90s that were dialing in their bass game. And another crusty 4-string beast I'd like to bring up here is Osrotten's Corey Lyons. Again, like most of his scene peers, Corey was not the flashiest player around, but god damn it did he know a grimy bass tone when he heard one, because it sounds like his amp is literally on fire on every single Aus Rotten recording. Like I said, not the toughest bass part to play, but a tone like this was incredibly crisp for its time, and I think his bass tones are pretty damn close to standard in crust punk these days.
On a side note, Aus Rotten and Dystopia are both bands that are very near and dear to me, and if you'd be interested in seeing a video about either of them, please do let me know in the comments below. I would love to further research and talk about them.
And finally, we cannot talk about gritty crust punk bass without giving a shout out to the filthy tones of Nausea's John Jesse. If you ask me, I would say his bass sound feels like a happy medium between the sludge-inspired Dystopia style and the burning amp sound of Aus Rotten. It's definitely got the fuzz and the low end to it, but there's also a lot of attack, and if simple, dirty punk bass lines are your thing, then Nausea's 1990 album Extinction is an album I would highly recommend checking out if you haven't already. Also, to close off the segment on 90s extreme punk music, we absolutely cannot leave Powerviolence out of the discussion. Granted, a lot of the bass players here were really just plucking the most abrasive and noisy chord progressions they could to go along with the loose guitar playing and the rapid drumming, so a lot of this stuff can be kind of one size fits all, or in other words, if you don't like one Powerviolence band, chances are you won't like anything else the genre has to offer. However, I do have to say that this was one of the first times in music history that it was cool in a specific scene to strip most elements of groove and rhythm away from bass and pretty much just play it the way Kerry King from Slayer plays his guitar solos. And alongside its sister genre, grindcore, Powerviolence was one of the first musical genres to solidify this concept as a playing style rather than just nonsensical noise. And abrasive or not, jamming this fast and hard in unison is a skill no matter how you want to look at it. And a lot of these bands could really play their asses off despite what a lot of people might immediately think.
So on one hand, skate punk bands were singing vocal harmonies and playing their basses as technically proficient as they could, while on the other hand, the crust punks were still screaming their faces off, but now their bass tones were grimier and fuzzier than ever. But that's just the two ends of the spectrum, and these two extremes certainly do not account for everything that punk rock and bass were doing together at the end of the 20th century.
As a lot of you guys probably know, the 90s were a time when punk rock was branching off into all kinds of different directions, and one of the most interesting turns it took during this decade was a fusion with ska music. The above-mentioned Operation Ivy and Rancid and their outstanding bass player Matt Freeman were of course significant players in this scene, but it definitely does not stop with them, and a few other ska punk bass players I think made a mark on the scene include Roger Lima from Less Than Jake, Jorge Casillas from Voodoo Glow Skulls, Danny Lore from Against All Authority, and Robin Gold from the UK-based Capdown. Granted, having a bass player that could bust out groovy walking bass lines on command was just as essential for ska punk in the 90s as a drummer that could nearly play at the speed of sound was for skate punk, so if I'm being completely honest here, most of the bass work on pretty much all the 90s ska punk shit is pretty goddamn on point. This is also equally as true for the genre's close cousin third wave ska with bands like Real Big Fish, Sublime, and the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, and while a lot of this stuff is quite a bit poppier than the straight up ska punk stuff and in some cases can be a little bit corny, we really cannot deny that there were and still are some top-notch musicians in this scene of all varieties, and especially when it comes to bass players.
I'm also curious how many of you guys are into ska, because I actually really like ska, and I'd be stoked to do some videos, but what I want to know is if that's something you guys would actually be interested in. Let me know in the comments below if a few videos on ska sound intriguing.
Another important piece of the 90s punk scene is the metallic or quote-unquote beatdown hardcore stuff that really caught on after its debut in the northeastern US during the late 80s. It's all super metal influenced, so the guitars and aggressive vocals are definitely taking a lot more of the spotlight, but there's a really groovy aspect to this genre that the bass really accentuates during the slower and mid-tempo spots. Plus, just because this stuff is at times as much metal as it is punk doesn't mean there aren't plenty of awesome bass licks in this genre. There's a number of really solid bass players from this scene that could groove just as hard as they could thrash, like Evan Seinfeld from Biohazard or Craig Sitari from Sick of It All and Youth of Today, but personally, I don't think anyone did it quite as well as Jorge Guerra from Madball, otherwise known by his stage name Hoya. I don't think I'm the only one who thinks Madball had one of the tightest rhythm sections in all of 90s hardcore, and at least 50% of that is because this dude consistently knew how to bust out just the right amount of low end at just the right times. Like the vast majority of his peers in the hardcore scene, Hoya's a little more of a groover than a shredder, but that doesn't mean he can't play his ass off, and I have to say, as someone who's been a Madball fan for over a decade now, I still think he's responsible for some of the best bass grooves in metallic hardcore as a whole. And finally, this video
would not be complete if I didn't shout out the gritty breed of street punk and oi that also came out in the 90s. The most notable band here is of course the previously mentioned Rancid, and although they came at it from a much more melody-driven angle, we can't deny that they exposed a lot of people to this spiky, shouty style of punk rock. Although most of its predecessor bands in the 80s did little more than follow the root notes of the guitar lines, once Rancid came on the scene in the early 90s, all of a sudden street punk bands everywhere were plucking and noodling their basses as fast as they could. And a few players worth shouting out here include Rick Bratt from the Lower Class Brats, Kim Chi and Ryan Sin from the Distillers, Trip Underwood from the Unseen, Kelly Halliburton from Defiance, and of course Rick Lopez from the Casualties. You can certainly hear the Rancid influence in the bass playing of pretty much everybody I just named, and while none of them quite had the skills Matt Freeman did, I think a lot of them actually did find their groove in their respective bands pretty well. Not to mention the fact that the noodly bass playing blends just as easily with the harsher style of street punk as it does with the melodic one. So much so that I think it would be interesting to hear what a band like GBH or The Exploited would sound like if their bass player could actually play his ass off like some of these guys could. Although I could probably drone on for another hour and a half about how rad the 90s were for punk rock bass, I think we've at least covered most of the important things, and the next decade would certainly be telling in just how crucial this era was for laying the groundwork for the next generation of punk rock bass players, especially in the realms of skate punk and metallic hardcore. So if you've watched any of my skate punk related content before, there's a good chance you may have heard me mention the New Bedford, Massachusetts quintet A Wilhelm Scream. While I can't deny they're certainly one of my favorite bands, I do genuinely believe they're one of the most important skate punk bands to come out of the past couple of decades. And as far as bass goes, nobody in the 2000s was playing bass in a punk band like Wilhelm's Brian Robinson was. While the band's original bassist, Jonathan Teves, was certainly a good bass player, when Brian joined the band in 2006, I think pretty much everybody in the scene would agree that this took Wilhelm to the next level. Brian basically took all the ideas that Little Joe had done with a pick and some overdrive and applied them to a fingerstyle technique and a squeaky clean bass tone. To put this into terms any non-musicians who might be watching can understand a little easier, he's essentially the guy that's good enough to play for a progressive metal band, but wound up joining a punk rock band instead. And as far as us Wilhelm Scream fans are concerned, he made the right decision. If you've seen these guys live, then you know what I'm talking about here. This dude can shred like nobody else. If you ask me, I would say he's in the top 5 most important bass players in punk history, and easily in the top 3 best players in terms of technical ability. Mr. Robinson was also the first and possibly the only person to bring bass sweeping to punk rock on Wilhelm's third album, Career Suicide, and if you're into melodic skate punk, he was also in a couple of other rad bands before he joined Wilhelm called Jerk Circus and the Full Blast that are worth checking out too. While Brian definitely holds the gold as far as 2000s punk rock bass is concerned, he was by no means the only gnarly bassist to make their mark on this decade. As I noted earlier, a certain Chicago native by the name of Joe Principe would join the infamous Rise Against after his last band 88 Fingers Louie disbanded in 1999. Although he certainly delivered some wicked bass licks during his time in 88 Fingers, I feel like he really didn't get his time to shine until Rise Against's debut full-length album, The Unraveling, came out in 2001. The album is full of all kinds of ideas that the writing style of 88 Fingers didn't really allow Joe Principe to execute as clearly, and its opening track Alive and Well is a perfect example of that with its grinding bass intro and chuggy break mid-song. This record and its successor, Revolutions Per Minute, both feature some outstanding bass work from Joe, and although personally I prefer 88 Fingers to Rise Against, I can't deny that these first 2 Rise records show off his playing more than any other project he's been a part of. Rise Against would drift away from skate punk into more of a pop punk direction after their first few records though, and unfortunately this meant Joe had to dial back his shredding a little bit. That being said, there's definitely a number of tracks from their later catalog that still show off Joe's NOFX and Rancid inspired riffing style. Like I was saying earlier, skate punk wasn't the only breed of punk rock that would have a few bassy innovations during the 2000s, and the second most obvious example that sticks out to me is in the world of metallic hardcore. If you know your metallic hardcore, then you know that the in thing in that scene is all about being heavy. Beefy guitars with really tight atonal drums, and of course a nice crunchy groovy bass to top off the mix. But something that really took off in the scene during the 2000s was the concept of downtuning for a heavier sound. Bands
Bands had of course toyed around with this towards the end of the 90s, but generally speaking, things didn't get any lower than a full step down, or in other words, tuning to drop D or D standard tuning. Again, if any non-musicians are watching, the best way I can explain this is by saying the pitch of the bottom note on the instrument is noticeably lower than usual, but not nearly as low as most metal and beatdown bands are tuning to these days. But anyways, as I was saying, this was still a really new thing in hardcore during the late 90s, and for the most part it was still pretty common for bands to be using the standard E tuning. However, once the 2000s came along, what was a trend that some bands were doing was all of a sudden the norm. This was the era that bands like Terror came out in, First Blood, Death Before Dishonor, 100 Demons, and 6 Feet Ditch. Tuning 2 whole steps down, or sometimes even 3, was becoming increasingly more common as hardcore drew closer and closer to its death metal influence in this decade. Hell, it wasn't all that uncommon to see these types of bands playing 7-string guitars or 5-string basses as instruments like that became more and more available towards the end of the 2000s. Of course, this isn't anything super innovative in terms of musicianship, especially since the 90s were really the era this stuff found its groove in, but I think the fact that low tunings are basically essential for this stuff these days is definitely an important mark as far as both guitarists and bassists in this scene are concerned. The trend of down tuning would also become reasonably popular within other breeds of hardcore punk like Crust and Powerviolence when bands like Tragedy, Resistant Culture, and Weekend Nachos came out, but it wouldn't really take off the same way it did with beatdown, as you'll still see bands in these camps using the standard tuning or drop D just as frequently.
Outside of skate punk and hardcore though, there were of course a few other interesting things going on in the 2000s in terms of bass.
The most obvious example here would be the use of a washtub bass or gut bucket in the folk punk genre, which has become increasingly more common as the genre's popularity drastically grew in the 2000s. The most famous example of this would probably be Jeff Bell, the longtime washtub player for Days and Days, but he's certainly not the only person to do this. To be honest, I think folk punk is actually a really interesting take on the genre. Most of it's just punk rock played on acoustic instruments, but I think it actually brought a number of new listeners into the scene with its more approachable, peaceful demeanor. I did a video a little while back about why I think a lot of punkers tend to not like this stuff, and the comments seem to be pretty half and half. Some people love it, some people hate it, but all that being said, I'd love to dive into it a little more with a proper crash course video, so let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in seeing that.
Moving on though, we definitely cannot talk about punk bass in the 2000s without shouting out the absolute beast of a bassist, Joe Keller from the New Jersey pop punk trio the Ergs. Everyone in the Ergs is of course an outrageously talented player, with them all being just as fluent in jazz as they are in punk, but to be completely honest, I think there's a lot of times on their albums when Joe really steals the show with his insane fingerstyle technique and his lines that flow up and down the neck at a breakneck speed. All of that being said, there's never really been another band quite like the Ergs over the years, nor another punk bass player quite like Joe. While this certainly makes a lot of sense as jazz musicians don't usually start punk bands in their free time, it does not change the fact that the Ergs, and of course Joe, could noodle and riff like no other pop punk band had ever done before, or possibly will ever again. If you've never listened to them before, I would highly recommend checking out their 2004 album, Dork Rock Cork Rod, and I've also done an entire video on them, so if you're interested in hearing the abridged story, you can definitely check that out too. There'll be a link to that in the description below. As punk bass has really done a solid amount of developing since the beginning all the way through the 2000s, there hasn't been a whole lot of new territory the genre has broken into in the past 12 or so years. While that's certainly not to say someone couldn't come along one of these days and bring something brand new to the table, as for right now, most of the bands doing new things in the genre aren't focusing too much on new innovations on bass techniques. All of that said though, the bass is without question a crucial element to punk rock no matter what type of band you're in. And although I certainly feel more comfortable in the role of guitar and or vocals, I definitely have a soft spot for the bass because it was the first instrument I ever picked up and really dove into when I was a kid.
I first started learning bass when I was about 12 years old, and over the years I took lessons here and there while also teaching myself to play through jamming along with my favorite punk bands. In my first band I actually played bass and sung, and I've had a couple of other projects over the years that I've reclaimed the role in. Matter of fact, my first band from high school actually used to cover Maxwell Murder, and I would always do my best to flub my way through the solo, although I'm certainly no Matt Freeman. Like I was saying though, I'm definitely a lot more comfortable in the realm of guitar and vocals, and that's what I'm doing these days in my band Zest. Of course, alongside my dear friend Alex Smith, who holds down the bass front exceptionally well in the band, along with sharing the lead vocals with me from time to time. He also runs an Instagram account by the name Squishy Skate Punk that some of you skate punk vinyl and CD collectors might already follow, but if you don't and you're into that sort of thing, definitely send him some love on the gram. His collection will not disappoint you.
But anyways, I think I've droned on for long enough. I want to hear what you guys have to say. Who's your favorite punk rock bass player? Do you play bass at all? If so, what's your favorite bass part you know how to play? And if not, what's your favorite one to listen to? Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.